Kevin had always been the quiet type, the kind of guy who blended in with the backdrop of a small town like ours. He wasn't overly flashy, but there was something about him that drew people in. I remember the first time I saw him at the local diner. Emma had just started dating him, and I could tell she was nervous. Not about him, but about how he'd fit in with us, her family. Kevin was sweet, smart, and from the outside he seemed perfect for her. But something in the back of my mind told me things weren't as easy as they seemed. It wasn't until the night he disappeared that I started thinking back on those early days. Emma was frantic when she called me, her voice shaky with that panic I hadn't heard in years. "He's gone, Mike. Kevin's gone. No one can find him." I could hear the desperation in her words, the fear that always comes with not knowing where someone is. I didn't have any answers, but I promised her we'd figure it out. Emma's mother, Michelle, had been the last person to see Kevin before he vanished. That alone set off a series of alarms in my mind. Michelle had always been a bit tough. Not in the way you'd expect, like someone who was obviously troubled or dangerous, but there was this underlying tension whenever she and Kevin were in the same room. Emma never picked up on it, of course. She was too blinded by love to notice. But I had. There was something about Michelle's eyes when she spoke to Kevin that didn't sit right with me. The police were already investigating by the time Emma came to me. They had tracked down CCTV footage that showed Michelle driving her car at breakneck speed into the woods behind her house the night Kevin disappeared. It was all too much to ignore. But even more shocking was what the cops found in those woods. Traces of blood, Kevin's blood. The authorities didn't need to be forensic experts to understand that the blood wasn't from a simple cut. Kevin had been badly beaten. I didn't know what to think. A part of me wanted to believe that Michelle wasn't involved, that there had to be some kind of mistake. But the evidence was piling up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's mother knew more than she was letting on. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, missing persons reports, and press conferences. Emma refused to believe her mother was involved, though. She held on to the idea that something had happened to Kevin, that he'd been taken by someone else, anyone but Michelle. But I couldn't help but notice how every time the police found another clue, her mother's demeanor seemed to shift. She'd grow quieter, more withdrawn. It wasn't long before the police discovered a hidden stash of strange items in Michelle's garage. Old tools, a few bloody rags, and something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a duffel bag filled with muddy clothes. At first, Michelle tried to play it off as something unrelated, something that had been there for years. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. Emma couldn't see it, though. She couldn't see the subtle way Michelle avoided certain questions. She couldn't hear the hesitation in her voice whenever she was asked about that night in the woods. And then came the phone call that shattered whatever was left of Emma's calm. It was the police, and they had found more evidence. Kevin's personal belongings, his wallet, his phone, had been discovered by a local homeless man deep in the woods, miles away from Michelle's house. The phone was cracked, but when the cops went through it, they discovered something horrifying: text messages from Michelle. She had been in contact with Kevin just hours before he disappeared. The messages were cryptic, almost frantic, and at first glance, they didn't make sense. One of the last messages Kevin received read, "Meet me at the usual spot. I can't wait much longer." It was clear now that Kevin and Michelle had been hiding something. But what was it? As the investigation progressed, I started getting involved more. I knew I had to. For Emma. For Kevin. I wasn't just the bystander in this. This was my family, my future that was unraveling, and I couldn't stand by without trying to make sense of the mess. It was late one night when I went through Michelle's house, looking for anything that might provide an answer. I didn't expect to find anything concrete, but I needed to do something. As I was rifling through drawers in the kitchen, something caught my eye, a small, leather-bound notebook hidden at the back of a cabinet. Opening it, I found pages of notes, written in Michelle's neat, precise handwriting. It was filled with strange entries, things that didn't seem to add up. Dates, references to the plan, and everything must be set in motion. My blood ran cold when I found a list of names. Kevin's name was at the top of the list. I didn't know what I was reading, but it didn't feel like just a random collection of thoughts. It felt organized, intentional. I knew Michelle had secrets, but this? This was more than I could have imagined. I immediately went to the police with what I'd found, and they took the notebook for further analysis. The police had already begun questioning Michelle again, and soon after, they uncovered even more shocking details. It turned out Michelle had been involved with some shady people, some from out of state, others who had deep connections to the darker corners of the underworld. A local businessman, a man named Robert Wexler, had been involved in multiple illegal activities, and it seemed like Michelle had been his accomplice for years. But what did that have to do with Kevin? A few days later, I got a call from Emma. Her voice was strained, her words barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mike. The police, they're saying things about my mom." I went over to her house immediately. When I arrived, I found Emma sitting on the couch, her face pale and distant. "She told me she didn't know where Kevin was," Emma said, her voice breaking. "But I found something, Mike. I found a receipt in her purse. It's from a gas station near the woods. The same woods where they found Kevin's blood. It was dated the night he disappeared." I felt the blood drain from my face. There was no way to deny it now. Michelle knew something. She wasn't just involved in Kevin's disappearance, she had played a part in it. For what? The police finally made an arrest. Michelle was taken into custody, but the answers we were all searching for didn't come easily. Michelle remained silent through most of the interrogation. She wouldn't talk about that night in the woods, not even when the police showed her the evidence against her. But it wasn't until Emma visited her in jail that Michelle finally broke her silence. "I didn't want to hurt him," Michelle sobbed, her face pale and haggard. "But he was going to ruin everything. Kevin knew too much." Emma stared at her mother, confusion clouding her expression. "Knew too much about what?" Michelle's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't have a choice, Emma. Kevin was too close. He was getting too close to the truth about everything." It wasn't until later, after Michelle had been sentenced, that we finally understood what she meant. Kevin had uncovered her connection to the criminal underworld, and he'd been trying to expose it. But in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. The truth was more horrifying than any of us had imagined. And now, all we could do was try to put the pieces of the puzzle together, pieces that Michelle had so carefully hidden. But no matter how much we uncovered, there would always be a part of me that wondered just how deep this web really went. It's been weeks since Kevin disappeared, and things were spiraling out of control. Emma's world, once built on trust and love, was unraveling fast. I could see the confusion and pain in her eyes, but I also saw the resistance. She didn't want to believe what was becoming more and more obvious every day, that her mother, Michelle, was involved in Kevin's disappearance. But now, even Emma couldn't deny the mounting evidence. I was with her one afternoon when she decided to go through her mother's phone. Something about it had been bothering her, and for the first time, she was willing to confront it. She had been avoiding any real confrontation with Michelle, too afraid to hear the truth, but now, she was determined to know. As she scrolled through the messages, she found several from Kevin. At first, they seemed harmless, simple good morning texts and the occasional joke. But as she read further, her face drained of color. "Emma," she said in a low voice, almost too quiet to hear. "He was going to leave me. He was ending things with me, Mike." I couldn't believe it at first. Kevin had been planning to leave her? He had been seeing someone else? The messages were clear. Kevin had told Michelle he was ending their relationship. He was planning to leave town with another girl. Emma was silent for a long moment, as if processing the betrayal. But then came the punch in the gut. One of the last texts from Kevin was a promise. "I'll be leaving soon. I'm sorry, but it's over. I'm not coming back." The more Emma read, the more she could feel her stomach twisting. It didn't make sense. If Kevin was planning to leave, why would he have been seeing Michelle the night he disappeared? Why had Michelle told the police she hadn't seen him? It didn't take long for Emma to find more. A photo. It was a grainy shot, but it clearly showed Kevin standing in Michelle's living room. He was laughing, his arms slung around her shoulder. It was an innocent picture, but it destroyed Emma's trust. This was proof that Michelle had lied. She hadn't been the innocent, unsuspecting mother Emma thought her to be. "I don't understand, Mike. Why did she lie? Why didn't she just tell me the truth?" Emma's voice cracked as she turned to face me. I could feel the anger building inside her. She wanted answers. She wanted her mother to admit everything. I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I didn't understand either. But I couldn't deny what was in front of us. The evidence, the lies, it was all adding up. Michelle had been hiding something far worse than I had imagined. And now, Emma was caught in the middle of it, trying to make sense of a nightmare. A few days later, everything took a turn for the worse. The police received an anonymous tip that led them to an abandoned warehouse just outside of town. I remember the phone call when they found out. They'd discovered a body. I could tell by the tone of the officer's voice that it wasn't good news. The next few hours were a blur of activity, the world spinning in slow motion as the police and investigators swarmed the warehouse. When the news came through that the body was Kevin's, it felt like the floor dropped out from beneath us. They said it was brutal. The body was covered in blood, battered from a vicious struggle. Kevin had tried to fight back. There were defensive wounds on his arms, scratches and bruises on his face. But the worst part? The wounds on his back. There were signs that he had been trying to run, trying to escape someone, but whoever had done this was too fast, too strong. They caught him. I felt a sickening knot in my stomach. The evidence spoke for itself. Kevin hadn't just disappeared. He'd been murdered. When the police told us that they had found Michelle's personal belongings in the warehouse, an old jacket with her initials on it, a few receipts that had her name on them, the pieces finally clicked together. She was involved. Michelle had been there, at that warehouse, the night Kevin died. Emma was destroyed. It was like everything she had ever known had been a lie. Her mother was not the woman she thought she was. Michelle had been hiding something dark, something evil, for years. And now, Emma had to face the truth. We didn't hear from Michelle for a while after that. She was arrested, of course, but she remained silent. It was like she'd gone into a shell. When they questioned her, she refused to speak. She didn't even react when they told her Kevin was dead. I couldn't help but feel that, deep down, Michelle had already resigned herself to what she had done. The trial would come later, and it would be long and painful. But I couldn't help but feel that none of it would bring Kevin back. None of it would erase the damage Michelle had done, not just to him, but to Emma too. She had lost not only the man she loved, but the woman who was supposed to be her mother. The truth was, this would never be easy for any of us. But the one thing I knew for sure was that Emma would never be the same. And neither would I. The truth had a way of tearing everything apart, and there was no putting the pieces back together. Not this time. Kevin's murder was horrifying enough, but the deeper we dug into the case, the more shocking and tangled the truth became. It started with the police finding a video on an old, hidden hard drive during a second search of Michelle's house. Emma and I were there when the police found it, watching as the officers exchanged grim looks before carrying the device out to their van. Something about it made my stomach churn. It didn't take long for the authorities to decode the hard drive's contents. What they found left no room for doubt. Michelle and Kevin had been involved in a secret affair. The video was grainy but clear enough to reveal Michelle trying to talk Kevin into staying with her. Her voice was calm at first, but there was an undercurrent of desperation. She was going through a midlife crisis, and Kevin, with his youth and charm, had become her obsession. The footage took a horrifying turn when Kevin told her he was leaving. He mentioned another woman, a younger girl he had fallen for, and said he couldn't keep living this way. Michelle's calm facade cracked. Her face twisted with rage as she began shouting at Kevin. The words were incoherent at times, but the rage was palpable. Then, in the final moments of the video, she grabbed a heavy object, a paperweight, maybe, and swung it at Kevin. The screen shook, and the video ended abruptly. Watching it, I felt a pit form in my stomach. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the moment Michelle decided to rewrite Kevin's fate. When the police confronted Michelle with the video, her defenses began to crumble. At first, she denied everything, insisting the footage was a fabrication. But her trembling hands and the way she avoided eye contact told another story. Finally, during an intense interrogation, Michelle broke down. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was going to leave me. He said he loved her. That I was a mistake." Her words spilled out in a torrent. She admitted that the moment Kevin told her he was leaving, something inside her snapped. She felt like her entire world was slipping away. Everything she had, her sense of control, her carefully constructed life, was crumbling. And in that instant, she decided she couldn't let him walk away. The fight escalated quickly. Kevin tried to leave, but Michelle blocked his path. The struggle ended with him on the floor, lifeless. As gruesome as the confession was, it didn't account for everything. The police pressed her on the events that followed the murder. How had Kevin's body ended up in the abandoned warehouse? Why were her belongings found there? Michelle hesitated, visibly shaken. "I panicked," she admitted. "I didn't know what to do. I thought, if I made it look like he disappeared, no one would connect it to me." She described how she wrapped Kevin's body in a tarp and loaded it into the trunk of her car. She drove deep into the woods, intending to bury him, but fear got the better of her. That's when she remembered the warehouse, a place she knew was secluded. She dumped his body there and tried to clean up the evidence, but she hadn't thought everything through. The most chilling part of her confession came when she explained how she had planned to cover her tracks. Michelle had left items of Kevin's, his wallet and phone, in locations that would mislead investigators. She had even staged text messages on Kevin's phone, sending them to random contacts to create an illusion of life after death. It was methodical, calculated. Yet, her paranoia led her to make mistakes, like leaving her personal belongings at the scene. By the time her confession was over, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the lead detective, a grizzled veteran, seemed shaken by the level of deception and the raw emotion Michelle displayed. She ended her confession with a tearful, almost pitiful statement. "I didn't mean it. I just couldn't lose him." As I sat with Emma in the aftermath, her world shattered, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we'd uncovered. Michelle wasn't the mother Emma thought she knew, and Kevin's death was far more than a tragic disappearance. It was a story of obsession, betrayal, and a descent into madness. And it left scars that none of us would ever forget. The days after Michelle's confession only seemed to deepen the darkness surrounding everything. The police didn't stop at just Kevin's murder. As they dug deeper into her life, they uncovered a web of lies, manipulation, and far more than anyone had expected. It turned out that Michelle had been involved in a number of other mysterious incidents in the town, things that hadn't been solved, or even fully investigated, before. Emma and I had learned so much already, but the truth kept spilling out like water from a broken dam. Michelle wasn't just some grieving mother caught in a moment of weakness. No, she was part of something bigger. Over the years, she had been involved with several criminal gangs operating out of the town and the surrounding areas. It wasn't just a random affair with Kevin, it was part of her attempt to regain control over something that had slipped through her fingers, control over her own life and over others. It all began to make sense when the police started piecing together her connections. Kevin's murder wasn't just a crime of passion, it was part of a conspiracy, a desperate attempt to prevent him from exposing her ties to these dangerous people. The further the investigation went, the more it became clear Michelle had been living a double life for years, hiding behind a facade of normalcy while manipulating those around her. What hit Emma hardest, though, wasn't the revelation of Michelle's criminal ties. It was something far more personal, something that shattered her image of her entire family. As it turned out, Emma's father, Thomas, had known about Michelle's affair with Kevin for a long time. He had suspected it, even confirmed it, but he had chosen to ignore it. Worse still, he had helped Michelle cover up the crime after it happened. When I learned this, I could feel Emma's heartbreak all over again. She had always thought her parents had been a team, a solid, loving couple. But the truth was much uglier. Thomas hadn't just stayed silent about Michelle's affair, he had actively helped her hide the evidence. It was a bitter pill to swallow for Emma, who had looked up to her father for so long. But there was more. While Thomas had helped cover up the crime, he had always held doubts about Michelle's involvement. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what Michelle had told him. In the days leading up to her arrest, Thomas had begun to reconsider everything, to wonder if he had been blind to the truth all along. Finally, he came to a decision. He would admit his part in the cover-up. He was going to come clean, face the consequences of his actions, and try to make amends. Emma didn't take it well. She had always trusted her father, and now, she felt like she didn't know him at all. She confronted him, demanding to know why he had kept quiet for so long. Why had he helped Michelle, knowing what kind of woman she really was? Thomas could only hang his head, unable to answer her questions. The guilt was eating him up, but there was nothing he could say to undo the damage. It was the day after Thomas had confessed his involvement that Michelle made another confession, though this one came from the cold, dark silence of her prison cell. The police had been interrogating her for hours, but they hadn't gotten much. That is, until she spoke up. This time, her voice was not trembling with emotion, but steely and detached, as if she had accepted the consequences of her actions. "I've been manipulating everyone all along," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "Thomas, the police, even you, Emma. I've been in control the whole time." Emma and I were at the station when Michelle was being interviewed. The words hit Emma like a slap in the face. She had always believed her mother was a victim in this story, but now, Michelle was admitting what we'd all feared. She had never been the helpless, confused woman we thought she was. She had been pulling the strings, orchestrating everything to cover up her own cruelty, to manipulate the people around her into believing she was something she wasn't. Michelle's confession wasn't just about Kevin's murder. It was about everything. Her entire life had been a series of calculated moves, designed to keep the truth hidden. She had convinced Thomas to cover up the murder because she knew how to play on his weaknesses. She knew how to make him doubt himself, make him feel like he owed her. She had used him, and now, with that confession, she revealed just how far she was willing to go to keep her life intact. In her eyes, there was no regret, no remorse. Just a cold, calculating smile as she spoke. "I never meant to hurt you, Emma. But you were never meant to know the truth." That was the moment when everything became painfully clear. Michelle wasn't a mother trying to protect her child. She wasn't a woman who had made a terrible mistake. She was a manipulator, a liar, and a murderer. And as much as it tore Emma apart, she had to accept it. Her mother wasn't just guilty of one crime. She had been orchestrating a larger conspiracy, using everyone around her to cover her tracks. The revelation about Thomas's involvement only added to the ugliness of it all. Emma had no idea where to go from here. Her family had fallen apart in ways that were beyond repair. Michelle was arrested, charged with not only Kevin's murder but with her role in the criminal network that had been operating under everyone's noses for years. As much as the investigation was unraveling, it was clear that the damage had already been done. For Emma, the truth was a double-edged sword. On one hand, she knew who her mother really was. On the other, she had lost everything she had once believed in. The investigation continued, but for Emma, the real challenge lay in picking up the pieces of her shattered world. Her father, too, had his own demons to face. He couldn't undo the past, and no amount of apologies would fix what had been broken. And as for Michelle, locked away in prison, she had won in her own twisted way. She had controlled everything until the very end. The trial of Michelle was nothing short of a nightmare unfolding in front of everyone. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with the weight of what had been revealed over the past few months. Emma, Thomas, and I were there, sitting in the cold seats as Michelle stood before the judge. We'd all been through so much already, but this was where it was all supposed to come to an end. Or so we thought. The trial began with the emotional speeches, particularly Emma's. She'd stood up in front of the court and shared her version of everything that had happened, the love she'd felt for Kevin, the devastation she'd experienced when she learned the truth, and the heartbreak of losing both him and her mother. I could see how hard it was for her, how the weight of the past months had drained her, but she did it. She spoke with a broken voice, but there was a strength in her words that caught the attention of everyone in the room. The evidence against Michelle was overwhelming. There were the messages, the video, the confession. There was the blood found in the woods, the CCTV footage, and the items found in the warehouse. Everything pointed to Michelle's involvement in Kevin's murder. The defense tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, someone who had lost control in the heat of passion, but no one was buying it. It was clear to everyone that Michelle had orchestrated everything, manipulating those around her and carefully covering her tracks. Her calm demeanor in the face of her crimes was chilling. After Emma's speech, the prosecution laid out their case in detail, pointing to Michelle's history with criminal gangs and her lies about the affair with Kevin. They presented witness statements, the video evidence, and expert testimony that showed how meticulously Michelle had planned Kevin's murder and tried to cover it up. She hadn't just been a woman scorned, she had been a cold, calculating criminal who knew exactly what she was doing. It was hard to even look at her by this point. She had become a monster in my eyes. The mother Emma had loved, the woman who had once seemed so nurturing, had been nothing more than a master manipulator. As the trial continued, Thomas was also brought to the stand. His guilt was evident in his every word. He admitted to his role in helping Michelle cover up Kevin's murder. He explained how he had helped her hide the body, how he had allowed her to manipulate him into thinking he was doing the right thing by protecting her. It was obvious that Thomas had been weak, too afraid to face the truth, too caught up in Michelle's web of lies. His remorse was palpable, but it didn't change the fact that he had been complicit in the crime. The judge's gavel finally came down, and Michelle was sentenced to life imprisonment. It was a relief to know she would never be free again. But even as she was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, there was something unsettling in the back of my mind. Michelle had done so much damage, but something told me that there was more to her story. The pieces didn't all add up. The real shock came when the court uncovered new evidence, something no one had expected. While going through Michelle's personal records and financial documents as part of the investigation, the police found something strange. It was an old case from Michelle's youth, a case that had never been fully investigated. She had been married once before, and her first husband had died under mysterious circumstances. At first, it didn't seem to be related to the case at all. But as they dug deeper, new evidence pointed to foul play. Michelle's first husband, a man named Frank, had been found dead in their home years before. At the time, the authorities had ruled it as an accident, a tragic fall. They said nothing more. But after re-examining the evidence, it became clear that it wasn't an accident at all. Frank had been killed, and Michelle had staged the scene to make it look like he had fallen. The police uncovered financial records showing that Michelle had been involved in a large life insurance claim just after his death. The timing was too coincidental, and the investigators began to suspect that Michelle had murdered Frank for financial gain, just as she had manipulated everyone else in her life. It turned out that Michelle had been hiding the truth for decades. She had killed her first husband and gotten away with it, just as she had gotten away with so much else. I couldn't believe it. All this time, Michelle had been living with the blood of not one, but two victims on her hands. It was like a dark cloud hanging over everything we thought we knew. Emma was in shock. She had always believed that her mother had been a victim of circumstances, that her life had been destroyed by the choices of others. But now, she had to face the fact that Michelle was a killer, someone who had ruthlessly manipulated everyone in her life to get what she wanted. The courtroom was stunned as the new evidence came to light. The prosecutors moved quickly to add charges related to Frank's murder. Michelle's life sentence was no longer just for Kevin's death, it was for the murder of her husband as well. The revelation left everyone in the room speechless. How had no one seen it? How had Michelle managed to hide her dark past for so long? The trial didn't end with a sense of closure, not for Emma, and certainly not for me. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole experience. Michelle had destroyed so many lives, and even now, as she was taken away to prison, it felt like she had somehow won. She had manipulated everyone, including Thomas, and had created a world where she was the master, pulling all the strings. For Emma, the betrayal was too much to bear. She had loved her mother, but now she was faced with the truth. The woman who had raised her, the woman who had given her life, was a killer, a cold, calculating murderer who had lied and manipulated her entire family. It would take Emma a long time to heal from this. Her trust in people had been shattered, and the foundation of her entire life had crumbled beneath her. As Michelle was led away in handcuffs, I looked at Emma, at the pain in her eyes, and knew that nothing would ever be the same again. We had uncovered the darkest parts of Michelle's soul, and now there was no way back.